Welcome to ECGC. Great field, great private there. Back on the digital front. So I'm going to be with you this week. I'm Jay Powell, CEO of the Powell Group, founder of Indie Game Business. Dan, my partner, is lurking around in the back, and you'll be seeing him some as well. But for now, we want to get started. Our first speaker of the day is Christopher Barney. He's a assistant professor at Northeastern University in game design, and he is going to be giving you the lowdown on creating your own game design pattern language. So if you've got questions for Christopher during the session, just post them in chat. We'll see them. We'll be able to get to them at the end. So don't think we're ignoring you. We'll get there. But with that, Christopher, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Jay. As they were saying, I'm Christopher Barney, and I'm going to be talking about creating your own game design pattern language. So let's go ahead and get started. So who am I? I first and foremost consider myself a game design student. I learned at a very early age that I loved games. It didn't occur to me at the time that they were something that I could actually produce and be part of. But when I got to college and got into computer science, I realized, wait a minute, I think I can do this. But there were no programs for learning game design at the time. That just wasn't something that that schools were teaching. And so my school allowed me to design my own curriculum. So I designed a game design program for myself and completed that course of study. Graduated, decided it wasn't enough, went to grad school and created a second master's level game design program for myself and finished that, and then eventually moved into the industry and continued to learn about games, right, for the next 25 years. I'm an industry veteran at this point. I worked for poptropica.com and funbrain.com making kids games. At our height, we had 10 million users a month on PopTropica and a total user count of around 500 million. So, you know, for a little game, it was a really big game. I've also done a bunch of indie board and card games at this point, and a lot of live action role-playing games run at various different conventions around the country. For the last 5 years, I've been a game design professor at Northeastern, teaching in their undergraduate game design program and also in their graduate game science and design program. And during that time period, I developed a lot of the content that I'm about to talk to you about. I'm a speaker. I've talked at conferences all over the US and in Europe, and I'm an author. I most recently wrote the Pattern Language for Game Design book. I have a Perspectives in Game Design blog where I have well over 100 articles covering topics from diversity in games, looking at different games design, and eventually talking about patterns quite a bit. So if you aren't interested in picking up the book, a lot of the content is available on the blog. Also, I'm a writer for interactive theater. I've worked for the Vermont and Connecticut Renaissance Fairs and had shows that have had annual viewership of 30,000 people. So a lot of experience doing that kind of thing, participating as an actor in interactive theater, doing stage combat, that kind of stuff. Fun fact. So getting on to the patterns. So what is a pattern? Patterns are a thing that were created by the architect Christopher Alexander in the 1970s. He was really dissatisfied with the state of architecture and wanted to figure out ways that we could understand how we had built great buildings in the past, even though a lot of the things we were building now were pretty impersonal and unpleasant to look at and be in. His ideas were somewhat controversial in the field of architecture. Some people loved them. Some people felt like they were undermining the architects who were very skilled and talented. But his ideas caught on. And the most well-known instance of them, where you've probably heard of design patterns from, is of course in computer science, where the Gang of Four wrote their design patterns book, created their set of core patterns, and those were adopted, and I've used them throughout my career. They're fantastic, they're useful, but I have some critiques of them. Their focus is very narrow. They're dealing just with object-oriented software, and they don't do a great job of telling you when you should use them. A lot of people will say, the singleton pattern is terrible, it causes bad software design, and that's because it's being used in places it shouldn't be used, right? But they don't give a whole lot of guidance in terms of figuring out what problem a particular pattern is addressing. Then eventually patterns moved into game design in the last decade or so. You have Game Mechanics, Advanced Game Design by Adams and Dormans. And I think they took a lot of inspiration from the design patterns book rather than from a pattern language, the sort of original source, in that they defined a very focused, narrow set of patterns that are excellent, right? They're about deep system mechanics. They're insightful. Absolutely read the book. The truths that they unearthed are profound and valuable. But again, they're very narrow in focus, and their concept is that they've essentially found the game design patterns. Here you are, we've found them for you. Go forth and use them to make better games. And you can, right? If you use them, you'll be making better games. You'll understand things better. But game design is more than just deep systems mechanical design. There's a lot more going on, and their patterns don't really address those things, don't interface with larger concepts, though they do give you some guidance as to when you might and why you might want to use their specific patterns. And then sort of lastly, there's Patterns in Game Design by Bjork and Helapainen, and they come closer to Alexander's original ideas and define a relatively broad set of patterns, and then continue to expand that in their online wiki of patterns, which is 800 plus patterns now, right? Covering all kinds of topics in game design. But they don't focus on what problems the patterns solve. So you have 800 patterns that address all kinds of things, and really the only way to figure out which ones you should use is to read them and intuit what their effect is going to be, what problems they're going to address. So if I have these critiques, do I have a better idea? And I think at this point I do. I think that when you're creating a design pattern, that there needs to be a design problem. It needs to address some problem that you're trying to solve in design. It has some effect. What is that? You need to be aware of it. And then it needs to provide a solution, right? Going back to the last slide, a solution that can be used a million times over without ever doing it the same way twice. So it needs to not be a recipe, but a description of a deep pattern that you can implement in a variety of different ways. I also think it's really important that you include example games. Show how the pattern can be used in different ways, concretely in different games that you've observed that pattern being present in. And then we'll get to these more in detail towards the end of the talk, but you need to tag the pattern with keywords that tell you what it's about, what topics it addresses. You need to identify other patterns that you know about that are related to it and how they're related. And you need to express your confidence, because just because you've observed a pattern doesn't mean that it's necessarily true, that you're right. How often you've observed it and a bunch of other factors relate to that. Again, we'll talk about that at the end of the talk. So how do you create a pattern? Well, let me go back. So example pattern here. The wonderfully pretentious title, The Three Pillars of Meaning and Emergent Narrative. That pattern says that design problem, given the reality of limited resources, when creating elements that encourage emergent narratives, designers need to maximize the narrative potential of every element they put into the game. How can designers know if a given element will contribute meaningfully to an emergent narrative? And then it provides the description, the pattern description of, to allow players to construct meaningful emergent narratives, developers should provide players with context, motivation, and consequence for their actions in the game. So any element that you add to the game, if you're trying to create emergent narrative, needs to have one to all three of those things to be contributing. So maybe that's true, and that seems like a good pattern to have, but how do you get to that, right? Did that just spring into my head as a piece of knowledge, or that I derived from my many years of experience? Where did that come from? So how do you get a pattern? I use patterns to teach in the classroom. I have students create their own patterns to essentially derive basic game design principles from first principles of design, rather than me telling them a bunch of detailed specific rules that they need to follow, right? They learn more if they come up with them on their own. And so I've created a large number of different exercises that students can go through to arrive at patterns that are focused on different areas of design. And I collect those in the book. But this is the most general pattern exercise, right? You could use this for anything. It's not focused on a particular kind of pattern, but it's sort of the basis for all of them. So the steps that you walk through to create a pattern: pick a game design element. Name at least 10 games that use that element. Then describe how each of those games use the element that you picked. And then describe the design problems that the games use the element to solve. So why do they use that element in the way that they do? And then once you've got all of that data, look at it and say, what are the patterns in the ways that those elements are used that relate to the problems that those patterns solve? So you're looking at all of your data, and then you're trying to arrive at a pattern. A gotcha thing that happens a lot is that people will name a game design element and then immediately come up with a pattern hypothesis, and then pick a bunch of games that they think will validate that, and then find things in those games that validate that. And they're like, look, I've got this pattern. It's like, well, that may be true, but it's constructed almost entirely out of confirmation bias. I don't think that's something we can completely avoid, but it's important that if you're doing this exercise, that you try not to jump to the pattern, that you go through the steps in order and only start trying to observe the pattern when you have all of the data listed out in front of you. Then you pick one of those patterns. And I say you pick one because often when you do this exercise, you end up with a significant number of patterns that you see about that element, right? Because there's more than one problem it solves. It's applied in different ways. So you pick one and then you describe it. And then you can go back and pick the others and also describe them as patterns as well. So you might end up with, half a dozen or more patterns based on working through this exercise one time. Okay, that's cool, but that's still pretty abstract. So I'm going to walk through that with a specific example. Okay, so name a game design element. So let's take jumping, for instance. Functional game design element, about the function of the game, right, as opposed to the form. And for the purpose of the example, I'm talking about jumping in terms of the player character jumping, not jumping in general in the game. So, okay, step one. Then moving on, name at least 10 games that use the element. So here I named way more than 10 games, and then I ended up grouping them together into games that I felt were using jumping in the same way. That may not always be super obvious. Street Fighter and Devil May Cry, they use jumping in the same way, Doom and Explosion Man, but you'll see how I arrived at those groupings later. But this was the initial list of all the games. Moving forward from that, you describe how each of the games uses the element you choose. So Donkey Kong Jumpman Geometry Dash, using jumping to avoid enemies and traverse 2D space. Gravity Rush and VVVVVV, using jumping and controlling physics at the same time. Doom and Explosion Man, using jumping for world traversal. Jumping assisted by the physics of unrelated systems, right? So rocket jumping, being thrown around by bombs as part of how you manipulate the jump mechanic. So I come up with all of these different ways that jumping is used in those different games. And then once I do that, step 4, what design problems do they use the element to solve? So again, you generate a huge amount of text. I don't expect you to read all of that. But out of that, you pull out things like you use jumping to create more movement options, to create a sense of autonomy, to create a sense of danger, to add variety to the gameplay, to create player mastery through skill growth, to create player mastery through subverting other systems, by giving the giving the character abilities that the player doesn't have, right? Or maybe to simulate how the real world works. Those may not exist in the same game. They're different ways that it's used. And then maybe to enhance combat. So you end up looking at all of that data and then pulling out what you think the possible patterns are. And so I ended up with 4 here, right? More complex mechanics provide more opportunities for players to demonstrate and acquire skill. So that's creating autonomy and mastery. Then when power has a cost, it makes it frightening to use. So you may, that cost and reward mechanic, dangerous jumping, using that to create balance. 2 great things that go great together, jumping and punching. So, using jumping as part of your combat system, your core combat loop. And then either the sort of 2 opposed patterns of she's just like me, or I want to be her when I grow up. She's just like me, maintaining immersion in the real world. The character moves like you do. They can jump in a realistic way. I feel that connection with the character because they behave like I do. Or aspirationally, the character has, Matrix level jumping abilities, or, Superman level jumping abilities, right? It's not realistic, but it's a power fantasy. So all of those are different ways. Then pick one and create a pattern. In this case, I pick the one about dangerous jumping. One of these days, it's going to get you killed. And now here's something where something interesting happens. The design problem turns out to be, how do you maintain game balance and create tension when giving the player power in their interactions with the game world, right? How do you balance giving them power and not having that make the game trivial? And then the pattern being, to maintain balance and create tension when designing character abilities, a designer may introduce consequences resulting from using those abilities. The result may be something natural, like falling into a pit of lava you try to jump over, or it might be something mechanical, like having weapon heat build up or a stamina meter. So note there that that pattern doesn't really have anything to do with jumping per se, right? Jumping is one possible example of implementing that pattern, but it's not necessarily related to the pattern directly, or the pattern relates to more. So it's important to recognize when you're creating your pattern that when you get to the step of articulating it, think about whether it's generalizable. Think about whether it moves beyond just the direct implication that you were thinking of and applies more generally. And then you need to cite examples when you're documenting it. And so you may have examples of this broader pattern that weren't actually in your initial set of patterns, or of example games that you started to derive from. So documenting the pattern in the pattern library, we'll get to that in a little bit. So that's patterns. An individual pattern, how you go about creating one. Those set of specific steps aren't important. Like I said, I've used 26 different exercises to create patterns. So as you get more experience doing this, you end up creating a set of steps for yourself that address the particular needs that you have. So I said creating your own pattern language, not just creating your own pattern. So what do I mean by a pattern language? Advanced slide. There we go. So what is a pattern language? So at its simplest level, it's a connected set of patterns. The connected being really important. So why would you want to have a connected set of patterns? And that you could have a different reasons, right? So the book, Gang of Four book, or the Adams and Dorman's book is like, well, we want to describe the patterns of game design or the patterns of object-oriented programming. We're going to create all of those and present them to you. And then everybody can go out and make great games with them. Or you could be creating a pattern language to help a specific designer, yourself or someone else, solve their specific design problem. In that case, you have a design problem, you create a pattern to help with it, you create related patterns and other related patterns, and eventually you've got enough of them that you can solve that design problem. That collection of patterns that addresses a particular design problem is a pattern language. It may be part of a larger collection of patterns, right? So at Northeastern, we've now created a couple of hundred patterns between myself and the students. And in my classes, students create their own patterns, but then also draw from that library to find patterns that support theirs, and to solve design problems that I present them with, and create and implement specific designs. I'll show one of those at the end of the talk. So how do you go about creating this interconnected set of patterns? Well, sort of 3 steps here. First, you have to connect the patterns. And like I said, you want to tag them with keywords so that you can then search by those keywords in order to find patterns that are related to each other in topic. You want to identify related patterns. So parents and children, additive, subtractive, and alternate patterns. By parents, I mean patterns that your pattern requires in order to function right. So if you have a pattern about jumping, there's probably a parent pattern that talks about movement in the game world in general, right? That is higher level and necessary for your pattern to even make sense. If you don't have movement, you can't have jumping. If you have a pattern about double jumping, then that's probably a child of your pattern about jumping in general. That's governs a specific instance of jumping. Additive and subtractive patterns that go well together. So you might have a pattern about mobility enhanced attacks and a pattern about jumping. Those two might make each other stronger by having both of them present in the game. Subtractive patterns that make another pattern less effective. Why would you want that? Well, you're trying to balance your game, right? If you have character power and a high-level character power for autonomy, if you give your character that at the beginning of the game, nothing's a challenge. So you might have a pattern about power progression in the game that's about restricting player power, at the beginning of a game in order to create challenge, and you would be balancing those 2 patterns with each other. Alternate patterns are patterns that you could choose one or the other, but probably not both. Patterns governing, say, camera perspective might be those. You're probably picking one that is strongest for your game or a particular part of your game, and you're not just sort of allowing the player to, dynamically toggle between them all the time. You might, but in general, you would be picking one thing or another. So once you've done all of that, then you need to understand the scope of your language. Are you making a narrowly focused language to deal with sound design, which if you look at that crazy interconnected diagram, that is from a sound design pattern language created by Alves and Roque. And they were focusing just on patterns relating to sound design, very narrow focus, but they acknowledged that. It didn't try to say these are game design patterns. They said these are sound patterns. So understand understand the scope of your language. How broad or deep is it? What's your confidence in it? When you notice a pattern, if you just made it up, then that pattern is going to really be your opinion about something. If you made it up based on having seen it in a game, there's a little bit more evidence behind it. If you found 10 plus games that reflect that pattern, there's a little bit more confidence, right? Is 10 enough? No, you should have 100, but no one's going to do that. So to practically move forward with this, start with 10, and then that's at least enough to base a pattern on. And then have you used the pattern in a game design and had it have the effect you intended? That'll increase your confidence. Did another group of designers come up with essentially the same pattern independently? That's going to increase your confidence, right? When you're linking the pattern to parents and children, how confident are you that that link is valid? That's how many times have you seen that link be necessary in games that are using both of those patterns? How often have you used those patterns together in that way and had the intended effect? So you rate your confidence. And then who's going to be using your language? So is it just for you? Is it for your design group? Is it for your studio? Is it for the world in general? You need to make sure the patterns are written in a way, use examples that will be meaningful to the group that you're targeting, right? If there's a game you understand really well and you use that as an example, but it's very obscure and no one else knows that game, it's less useful. Is there a more common game that uses that same pattern? That would be a better example. So consider that when going forward. And then making your patterns findable. You need to store them and present them in some way where people can filter them by those keywords that you've created, where they can link between the different related patterns in a way that makes it easy to explore the language. Probably you need to be able to search by title, search by the text inside of the pattern, and then you probably want to share your pattern with others. And the pattern library website that I built that's free, that goes with the book, tries to address a lot of those concerns, right? You can create groups that you can share the pattern just within your group. You can share it for everybody. People can be members of multiple groups. Patterns can be assigned to multiple groups, allowing a sort of robust way to share and interact with the patterns. Certainly, you don't need to use that kind of a tool or build it. You could use a wiki and achieve a lot of the same functionality. I've found wikis a little bit difficult to navigate, and wanted to build a custom tool to make my data more accessible. But my job in other lives has been as a web designer and web systems designer, so it was pretty easy for me to build something like that from scratch. I don't necessarily recommend it for every group. All right, and then library for patterns in game design. The library that I created is one possible implementation. It's not the only way to go about it, but I think it works pretty well. The ability to search by keywords, to filter by different authors, by what group it's part of, searching by the pattern's name, browsing and navigating the pattern, in the overall library. All of those things work pretty well to allow people to use the pattern. I can say that now with some confidence. I've been teaching with this tool in the classroom for 2 semesters now, and the quality of students' work has increased from the time when I was just using a Google Doc that everybody put their patterns into and searched for them, right? So it's at least an improvement over that sort of base technique. So moving on. So why do you need your own pattern language? Why not just go and use the one that I created, or the one that Bjork and Halopainen or Adams and Dorman's used? Why would you want to do this on your own? Seems like an awful lot of work. So the problem space of game design is too large for any one designer or group to derive patterns for all of it, right? I don't have the expertise to derive sound design patterns. I don't really have the expertise to derive the kind of systems patterns that Adams and Dorman's did. They may not have the expertise to derive the sound design patterns. So, you may have a set of needs that aren't going to be met by an existing language. And your needs may be very specific. Like, you have a particular design problem you want to solve, and you need patterns to solve that problem. At least now, it's likely that all those patterns don't exist, right? So if you want them, you're going to have to build them. And if you have very specific domain knowledge, right? If you're a very sophisticated designer, you probably know and can recognize patterns that others can't. If you are so that's one part of it. And then the last part is creating your own language becomes a framework to hang your understanding of design on. If you're a experienced designer, you know a lot about design. And you've created some kind of internal scaffolding to hang your design on. Maybe you're thinking about game design in terms of an existing framework like the MDA framework, or you're thinking about it in terms of types of fun, or you're looking at game design through Jesse Schell's lenses. And all of those are really valuable ways to do it. But again, they don't necessarily address your needs or your way of understanding games. Building your own pattern language and creating those connections between different game design ideas that you have. Yes, the link to the pattern website is provided at the end. I have a resources slide, so you'll be all set. So you're creating your own framework for how you understand design. And that's useful to you if you're an experienced designer, and really useful to you if you're learning design, right? If you're still expanding your design knowledge, and frankly, we all are, but if you're at the beginning of design and you're having professors and professional designers throw all of this knowledge at you, and you're just sort of stuffing it all into your brain. When do you need to use what? How do you decide what techniques that you're learning are appropriate? Creating your own pattern language helps you scaffold that framework for yourself. And I've found that to be really useful in terms of teaching. Found students have better retention. They do better when I ask them about ideas, when they've derived those ideas themselves and when they've connected them to each other. So I'm seeing positive early evidence that is an effective way to think about design and to order your design thoughts. All right, what would you do with the pattern language if you had it? Well, it's good for learning design. So if you are actively pursuing your own design education, it's a good way to go about doing that. It's good for teaching design. So if you're a professor and you're trying to have a core set of learning takeaways for your class, building pattern exercises around each of those and having your students derive those core ideas themselves has seemed to be pretty effective. And then let's see, understanding your successes and failures. If you have a game that does really well and you want to know what you did right, what was your secret sauce? Doing an analysis of the patterns in your game, even if you didn't build the game using patterns, can help you understand why it was successful. If you have a game that flops and you just don't know what went wrong, looking at that game and identifying its weak points, doing pattern analysis on those techniques, seeing how it differed from games that are out there that also use those techniques and succeeded, can help you with your postmortem. Again, obviously solving a specific game design problem, the patterns will help with that. On a large scale, doing pattern-based game design is a thing that can happen. Final projects for students in 2 of my classes are take the pattern language and come up with maybe 5 to 7 patterns, and then structure your game around those patterns. Use that as the seed for your design. So it can be used for wholesale design, although it's probably not your first use of patterns, right? You really need to buy into them as effective before you commit to that kind of thing. Communicating your design ideas clearly is really important. So we have a problem with terminology in game design, that we all use words to mean slightly different things, and we can get in heated arguments about what the meaning of something is. By presenting a pattern that conveys your idea, talks about the design problem, talks about the solution, gives a set of examples, when somebody reads that, they know what you're talking about, right? So it can be a good way to communicate the basic design ideas around your game. And then I believe that in the end, using patterns will help us reduce risk when producing games. If we're prove patterns are effective, use them, document it, then over time we can say that this new game that's innovative and isn't doing things the way other games do is using a bunch of patterns that are proven to be successful, that those new innovative techniques are backed up by functional experience of patterns that work. That's something that will bear out over time. And my continuing research at Northeastern is around that, right? Determining whether or not we can reduce risk by using patterns. And if we can, that could be very important for the industry, because managing risk is one of the biggest limitations we have. All right, so I wanted to give an example really quick of one of the student projects that used patterns. So I had one student create a pattern that said that shooting can be pretty boring in games if that's the only thing that you do, and that a way you might avoid that is by having whatever the core mechanic is, shooting for example, change the way that the game functions, or have that change from situation to situation. It's how it's used. So use shooting for more than one kind of thing. And then a separate group of students based their one of their projects on that. And they said, okay, that's an interesting idea. We're going to implement that by making shooting shift the player to another dimension. So every time they fire their gun, they swap between a different dimension. And some objects exist in both dimensions, some only in one or the other. So in the pictures down there, you can see that the orange walls exist in one dimension, the blue walls exist in the other. They then complicated that by placing enemies in front of or behind walls so that you could get to or block them by toggling between the environment. Then they made enemies that were in one dimension or the other, and so you had to be in a place where they weren't when you fired your gun so that your bullet would hit them when you swapped to the dimension that they're in. And then they combined all of those things in that final room that you really can't see in the bottom corner of the last picture, and created a situation where you were standing on a floor in one dimension and you had to jump up into the air and fire, which would make the floor disappear, and the enemy below appear, hit it, and then land on the floor that had just appeared on the other side of the room. Created this incredibly kinetic, dynamic shooting puzzle game that I think has the kind of potential that Portal did, and that's based off of using a pattern to derive gameplay. And lastly, as promised, here is a set of resources for game design patterns. The free pattern library up at the top, patternlanguageforgamedesign.com. You can also get access to buying the book through Amazon or through CRC Press that publishes it. But that's certainly not necessary to use the library. So you can look at it there. The game design blog that talks about everything I've talked about in this talk, and then breaks down how to use the library and a lot of the theory, as well as tons of other game design stuff. That's a link to Stefan Bjork, who maintains the collection of 800 plus patterns. They're in a wiki format. Awesome work there. Patterns from Patterns in Game Design, which is the sound design pattern. There's a paper on that linked here. Patterns in Game Design by Bjork and Halopainen. You can get that through Amazon or their publisher. Just Google it. Game Mechanics Advanced Game Design by Adams and Dormans, again, highly recommended. Talks about a lot of things outside of patterns, but also has a little pattern library it provides. Pattern Theory is not about game design, but it's a 100-page long book that really digs into how patterns work, what they're useful for. If you want more theory, want to understand patterns deeply, recommend that. And then, of course, A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander was the book that started all of this. And he's written, a dozen books that everyone should read. Phenomenal thinker. If you're interested in hearing more about all of this, also Google Jesse Schell's talk from GDC about using patterns in narrative design. All right, so questions here. Let's see. I believe you were going to come on and present the questions that were posed in chat. If not, I can scroll up in the chat and look at them.
Oh. Yep, Christopher, hold on a second. So
right.
There was one earlier that I lost. Okay, so Christopher, they covered the resources about patterns right there. So this is the next question.
Cool. Let's see. Would I like to provide another example on maybe having a weapon switching system? Yeah. So just real quick for Dustin, are you asking to have a pattern about a weapon switching system, or about using weapon switching as another example of the pattern that we walked through in the beginning? Because so for having patterns as a weapon switching system, if you're looking for a pattern derived from that, you would then look at games that have weapon switching systems and how they work. So any game with multiple weapons, you might come up with a game where weapon switching is very easy and fast. You might come up with a game where you have to pick weapons and you're limited to the weapon that you have when you go out into the game world. You might pick, games that you change your weapons over time as you find new weapons in the game world. You might say when weapon switching is used to address different enemies, or is it used to address different environmental situations? And you would look at all of those different patterns, or all those different games that are using weapon switching, and say, are there ways that are there things that are replicated between games about how they're using them? Generally, having weapon switching gives the player more choice. Weapon switching may be a way to scale up player power in order to match enemies that are more complicated, or to change gameplay style, right? You have enemies that can't be hit by ranged weapons, and you need to switch to melee weapons in order to address them when you run into them. Then looking at all of those different kind of uses, are there patterns about autonomy? Are there patterns about player progression? Are there patterns about using weapons to guide how players move through the world? You might have a Metroidvania style games where the path you move through the world is being governed by what weapons you have available, because they allow you to destroy different kinds of terrain. And in terms of what that actual pattern would look like, you'd really have to do the exercise to see that. Let's see. There's a question here about whether it would be possible to copy the slides, and for that one, hopefully they will be available through the conference, and the talk will be available through the conference. I would be happy. I will post them to the game design blog, and that way you can go to that. It's linked in the resources slide, which, if we can leave that up so people can copy it down, then the perspectives in game design will have a link to the slides. And then let's see, there was a question about, I hope it's not irrelevant, but do you think that what do you think of mixing two big gameplay elements? It could bore the audience, but who's bigger fan of one element but would support the game being a unique thing? And certainly, so there are patterns around that, right? Like, when does that work? And when does having two different gameplay elements that are sort of opposed to each other, when does that detract from the game? And when is that not fun, right? When is it peanut butter and chocolate, and when is it having a cooking system in in the Pokemon Sword and Shield, where if you don't like cooking games, you completely ignore it for the whole game. Looking at games where it works and where it doesn't work, looking for the pattern in why would help you then implement the two mechanics that you have in a way that are going to enhance the game, rather than alienate half of your audience. So I think that patterns would be very useful for solving that design problem, but you'd have to do that exercise. It is work. You don't necessarily have the patterns when you start out, but you would go to the library, you would search for the two techniques you're looking for, and you would see if there's patterns that relate to the combined use of them. And then if those patterns have a parent, that might be the pattern that you're talking about. There was a question of, will the pattern language that each individual designer creates become almost a framework for their creative process and expertise? And yes, very much so. I think that one's individual pattern language is sort of a template, a mind map of that person's design style. And that if we're all contributing to shared pattern libraries, then that's going to be a very broad understanding. But if you then filter by a particular designer, you're going to start seeing patterns that they're using, right? Like, I can imagine, if our favorite game designers had all been building patterns throughout their career, and you could look at the patterns they're using, you would see distinct pattern languages that reflect their design styles. And as we start to accumulate enough patterns for that to happen, that's going to be a really exciting thing to be able to do as a games researcher and as a game designer who wants to understand how someone is as good as they are. Let's see. Looks like we have like 5 minutes left. Have I used these patterns with regards to my work previously, timing the amount of time spent on a different thing throughout the project to predict schedules in the future, or only in design? So I've begun to start using patterns in my own design. as the beginning of a process. And I'm watching students each semester. I had 8 groups of students using pattern-focused design, right? Starting with a set of patterns and executing their projects. The projects have come out to be more focused and more extensive than projects in the same class before we started using patterns. So my preliminary and mostly anecdotal evidence is yes, that is something that seems to be true. Let's see.
Sure, I can get the questions for you if you would like.
Sure.
Hey, Christopher, how's it going? I'm Dan, everybody. So here's from Swatakita, Logan Holt. Hey, Christopher, I want to make a heat system for my action game that acts as the player's health and special gauge, supporting a risk versus reward system. How can I make such a system fun?
Right. So, again, there's a pattern that was relating to that. The jumping pattern that we talked about at the beginning as an example is one thing to consider. When does that balance between risk and reward become restrictive, and when does it increase challenge? So the more heat that's generated per resource that you use, the more restrictive the system is. And if you turn that up, if you tune that really high, you have a high consequence for acting, then you're limiting the player's ability and autonomy. And that's going to, at a certain point, make the game less fun. And so, patterns aren't the only solution. They tell you how that operates. And then knowing that that's the axis that you're designing on, you then are going to play test, and you're going to adjust that balance of how much heat is generated for each thing that's happened, and when do players start to find that restrictive rather than having that force them to be strategic. And you'll do that by observing their behavior, by putting metrics into your game, and by interviewing them after play tests. And so patterns are going to tell you how it works, but the actual player experience you have to monitor in terms of the players. The using patterns does not replace the need to do iterative design in any way. I wanted to address the question about confirmation bias, if you want to pull that one up. So when does a pattern cross over from a legitimate pattern to confirmation bias? I think all patterns are probably going to start out as confirmation bias. But we operate, like our brains operate on observing patterns in the world. We're good at doing that. We're also good at finding the patterns we want to find, right? And so there's going to be confirmation bias when you're starting out. In order to overcome that, I start all patterns out at 0 confidence. When I arrive at a pattern, I assume it is just confirmation bias and that it is worthless, other than as a thought exercise. Then I say, does this pattern exist in a game? Like, can I observe it, and document its existence? And I raise the confidence slightly, and then all of those things that I discussed that raise confidence, and I break down that rubric in detail and an algorithm for creating a confidence number in the book and in the blog. But you have to work your way out of that pit, and you're never going to be 100% sure, because even if you and 20 other independent groups of designers, you may all be sharing the same confirmation bias, right? So having a more diverse group of people find the pattern probably helps increase it, and seeing it used successfully over time. Then eventually, high confidence patterns that have been demonstrated a lot of times, those are the ones that are actually going to start reducing risk, and that we can be, are more like proven hypotheses, right? Or hypotheses with reasonable proof behind them. You want to pick another question?
Yeah, sure. We've got another one here. Do you think, this is from G-Man, do you think the pattern system can solve issues with gameplay balance? One of my fears when making a game is that it's balanced so it's fun to the player.
Yeah, so patterns are going to help you find things that will that you can use to control balance, right? Find things, understand how balance works in terms of the mechanics that you're using in the game, in terms of your specific design, And then you're going to have to adjust those sliders, right? You're going to have to do iterative testing to bring the balance to your game. Patterns may help you get in the ballpark. They're not going to solve issues with balance, but they're going to be a valuable tool that's going to help you understand what you can do to create balance in your game. They're certainly not going to replace designers, right? You're never going to have an expert system that applies a bunch of patterns and then produces great games. Patterns are a tool that we use to understand the deep mechanics and interaction between them within our games, and then can use them to create the effects that we want in our audience. Are we running out of time? Are we all right?
No. You can go to the top of the hour if you need to.
Okay.
Yeah, so here we go. From Cathorses says, comparing game designers to athletes, is studying patterns like studying the principles of walking in a lab or like training to run faster? Are patterns a tool for designers or more so for researchers?
I think that the answer is both. I'm interested in patterns as a researcher, interested in understanding games and using them to analyze games, right? So taking a game and doing a pattern analysis and trying to understand how it works, if those patterns apply to other games, there's plenty of room for studying patterns academically, and I think that'll make them stronger. That's where my work as as faculty is headed. But at the same time, students are using patterns to train their game design brains to understand how to design. And even if they go through my courses, build a bunch of patterns, and they never build patterns again in the rest of their career, the understanding that they built using patterns is what they're applying to their game design. So I think that's valuable. But I also have professional designer friends who had specific game design problems and have applied patterns to them to solve those problems to produce games in the field. Recent Kickstarter that just funded Little Nemo and the Nightmare Friends by Christopher Totten and his team, they applied patterns when designing their character abilities in their side-scroller Metroidvania game based on the Little Nemo property. So they're definitely able to be applied in live design, and I think can be very useful there, and useful as to create a shared design language for a team. If I was building a new team, having people work on patterns during pre-production around the things we were doing, even if we didn't use those patterns directly, it would allow us all to understand each other's design language in the domain that we were working in.
Right. Well, we do have a couple more minutes. And so if you do have some more questions for Christopher, please post them in the chat and we will get to them ASAP. There was a question I wanted to address up here from Dustin Howard. Will every YouTube stream be kept here indefinitely? I would imagine so, even though these videos are unlisted right now because they are for people that sign up for them only. But I would imagine that so. If you do have some more questions or want to continue this with Christopher, you can go into the Discord at discord.gg/indiegamebusiness. And let's see, let me go over here. To read this into. Oh, you at the Indie Alley Showcase, right? So vote on the art contest at the Indie Alley Showcase, and that should be in the Discord at discord.gg/indiegamebusiness. And we have 5 categories of channels on the Discord specifically for ECGC. And you can hang out there for a little bit after this, Christopher. So
yeah, I'll hop over to the Discord and do that. There was one question on what patterns can you use for programming, and right, in that case, certainly you can start with the Gang of 4 book. Those are some great patterns to start with. But if you are wanting to apply patterns to programming, and it should be pretty evident to everyone that patterns aren't just useful for game design, right? You could use patterns in film design. You could use patterns in writing. You could use patterns in coding. Social sciences have used patterns a bunch. There's a lot of work around using them in terms of pedagogy and learning theory. So you can create patterns using these basic ideas in whatever your field. Instead of looking at 10 games, look at 10, movies that use a particular cinematic technique and see how it's applied. So look at 10 different programs that accomplish what you want to accomplish well, and how did they go about doing that? You can use the same process in pretty much any field. games is just mine, and probably most of ours. So, all right, I'll be in Discord. So
in the Discord, yes. Thank you all so much, and hang out for the very next talk we have coming up in approximately 5 minutes. Nice. So thank you, everyone, and jump on into the Discord.
All right, thank you all.